Welcome to the Law School Insider, where we have conversations with students, lawyers, and employers.
Succeeding in law school is something that you must prepare for, not only before you begin, but throughout your law school journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. I am your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis, and I will draw from my over 20 years of experience in the college admission field, as well as bring forth the experiences of others as we delve deeper into the issues. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Law School Insider. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Lewis. I am so excited to be able to have you back again this week. And this week we're doing something a little bit different because I wanted to be able to show you something that one of the student organizations at Western Michigan University, Cooley Law School, brought to campus to be able to help students to better understand the world around them and to better understand how law intersects with the world around them. The Christian Legal Society at the Grand Rapids campus of Western Michigan University, Cooley Law School, recently brought in some guests to speak on a brand new series that is available now online. And they talked about the third part of a series called PovertyCure, entitled Justice for the Poor. Now, this series explores the roots of human flourishing and focuses on entrepreneurial solutions to poverty. So this specific conversation looks at that video, and though this is audio, you're going to hear the video, and I think you'll get a good understanding of what is going on as well as what is happening. Now, the movie itself travels from Kibera, which is a large urban slum in Nairobi, to central Buenos Aires, to 10th century China, in order to determine how the lack of a rule of law can impact the poor in society. This talks about private property rights, it talks about ownership rights, it talks about a lot of different things that impact all of us. And these are the type of conversations that you have in law school. So I wanted to make sure that you had a good understanding of what kind of conversations happen when you do go through law school. And you're going to also get to meet two great guests in this conversation. Patrick Oetting, who is the Alumni Relations Director, and Andrew Vanderput of PovertyCure Strategy and Engagement Manager. And both of them came to this conversation to specifically talk about this film, but also what can be done to combat poverty in our own communities. I think you're going to really enjoy it. And as I said, it's something a little bit different. So I'd love your comments today. What did you think? Leave us a comment in the notes today. Feel free to reach out and let us know as well. So without further ado, here's the presentation, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you all for coming.
So my name is Andrew Vanderput, and I'm here with my colleague, Patrick Oetting. We're from the Acton Institute. I'm specifically part of the PovertyCure Initiative, and really the goal of the PovertyCure Initiative is to bring about entrepreneurial solutions to poverty and really give people the proper framework to think about how to address poverty. So the episode that Abby and I chose to show you from the PovertyCure DVD series is about the rule of law, and how the rule of law is a really key ingredient that's missing from the developing world and how that leads to poverty in a lot of ways. And so you'll see a lot of different examples of how this plays out in the developing world. And so we'll watch it. It's about 26 minutes long, and then we'll have a little discussion and ask any questions that you wish. And hopefully you'll really see some applications for you guys in your legal careers and as you move forward here in school. So I'll start the movie and kind of go from there.
Over 1 billion people around the world live in poverty. Human beings created in the image of God. As Christians, we're called to help, but sometimes our help can make things worse. We wanted to learn more, so we hit the road. We traveled to crowded cities and rural villages. We visited churches and orphanages and businesses, and met people from all walks of life to listen and to learn. We asked, what has worked? What has failed and why? What's new and effective? And what are the forgotten truths in need of rediscovery? We asked, what are the foundations that allow human beings, families, and communities to thrive.
Go and look at the tallest tree in the forest and pick the best seed of that tallest tree and plant it in a flower pot. You get about a meter high or less than a meter high plant, exact replica of the tall tree that you saw in the forest. So what's wrong with this little one? Is it the seed? No, we picked the best seed possible, planted it on that. So what's wrong? The wrong thing is the flower pot, because you didn't allow the base on which it could grow. If you had planted in the real soil, it would be as tall as the tree that you saw in the forest. So poor people are bonsai people. Society doesn't provide them the base.
One of the trends in development is a growing appreciation for entrepreneurship and enterprise solutions to poverty. When you look around the developing world, one thing is clear. The problem isn't a lack of entrepreneurs. What's lacking is the fertile soil that allows entrepreneurs to flourish. We've talked about access to capital, but it's more than that. What poor countries need are the conditions of justice. Things like private property and rule of law that allow individuals and families to create wealth and prosperity for themselves and their communities. Now, property rights and rule of law can seem mundane and academic, especially when people are in dire need. But as we'll see, the Bible repeatedly emphasizes their importance, in part because they are crucial to creating justice and opportunity for the poor.
Here we are in Kenya. And the one thing that is manifestly obvious on any street you walk down in Kenya is the energy of the people. You can just tell that they're looking for opportunities, they're going someplace, they have a sense of determination, they have a sense of purpose. And yet, just in back of the facility that we're at here, there's a huge slum the size of Central Park. Why is that?
My name is Joshua Omoga. I'm a businessman operating a shop within Kibera. I left my rural area to come to Nairobi to search for a job and better my life. After searching for a job for more than 5 years, I could not find a job. So I started a small-scale business. I borrowed some money from a friend. I started by selling vegetables by my doorsteps. And out of that small-scale business is what is now sustaining me.
When I was in Nairobi, I had the chance to talk with Joshua and visit his shop in Kibera. He has no private property or land titling, so he can't get access to the sort of financial tools that business people in the West take for granted.
I live in the same place I work, and this place is very small. Now, the place is not mine, so you cannot expand it. It's not easy to register the business because Kibera has temporary structures, and the government does not recognize temporary structures to be registered. So that's one of the challenges I'm facing. My future plan is to invest heavily in my business, and I'm planning to relocate from Kibera to another place where life's more better than in Kibera, and register my business. For now, I'm saving for my son so that when he reaches the time he's going to start his school, primary level, I'll be having something in the account to support his education.
Joshua is like many entrepreneurs, looking to provide a better future for their families. But this lack of clear private property rights and rule of law stifles the entrepreneurial spirit and blocks the capacity to create prosperity for themselves and their communities. One of the things that's very interesting when you come to Argentina and you arrive in Buenos Aires, it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. You think you're in Paris or some lovely European capital. It has wide streets, beautiful architecture, an abundance of restaurants and cafes, and a rich cultural life. Yet only a mile from here, we can see some of the most intense poverty imaginable. Sometimes the physical differences between rich and poor neighborhoods are so palpable that it's easy to miss an immaterial difference. The poor section has almost no access to the courts, no enforcement of contract, no clear property title, and often very little police protection. It lacks the rule of law. We saw this concretely in an area outside of Buenos Aires called La Cava. Marcos Hilding Olsen is a city councilman in the local area who works closely with leaders and residents in La Cava to help develop the rule of law.
La Cava is this shanty town where different estimates calculate between 15 or 20,000 people live there. Policemen don't go inside of it. There's no taxes. People don't even pay for their electricity. And so it's a place where they live apart from the rule of law. A few years ago, there was some really high crime rates in the area of whole San Isidro. And many people blamed it that many of the crimes came from people inside the Cava. So the government decided to put policemen, but they put policemen on the borders of the Cava. They go around the streets, but they don't go inside. It is a sort of wall that they put, but it's a way of protecting people that live outside the Cava from people that live inside it. But they won't protect the people that live inside it. They are the ones that actually suffer the most insecurity of all. Because most of the people that live inside of it are people that are hardworking and they want to have a better life and they want to develop and they try to get their kids to school and they're really struggling to have a better life.
The real problem for large numbers of people is that hitherto, at any rate, there has been no reason to make an effort because any effort to improve their situation will just be expropriated by the political class.
When you have corruption in a country, people are just discouraged. There is no hope. They don't see themselves successful in the long term. The government is not putting in place that environment that can help you to have that hope. It's just useless.
The rule of law, I think, is best understood by considering its opposite, which is the rule of man. The rule of man is when you have the rule of force, the rule of power, the rule of arbitrary subjective opinion. The rule of law means that there are stable, reasonable laws that apply to everyone, regardless of their station in life. In many developing countries, you really don't have rule of law. You don't have contracts. You have corrupt judges, you have people who have judges sitting in on their own court cases who happen to be their brother or their sister.
Try and imagine a football match without rules. Well, you don't get a game going. The rules are crucial to get that game going. But everybody knows how to drive a ball. Everybody knows how to buy and sell. So there's plenty of entrepreneurship in the world. The problem are the rules. In 2/3 of the world, there isn't yet the rule of law.
Hernando de Soto is one of the world's leading experts in economic development.
In his work, DeSoto emphasized the need to extend the rule of law to the poor, who are often left out of the system by a wall of complex regulations that only the rich and well-connected can possibly navigate.
A lawyer friend of ours in Lima told us, law is not a problem. Hernando, we've set up a small company for you in about 30 days. So we set up a small little workshop outside Lima with 2 sewing machines and put 4 students under the supervision of a mature lawyer to go out and take a bus every morning at 8 o'clock and go out and comply with all the legal requirements to have those 2 sewing machines operate as a shirt-making factory. And it took them working 8 hours a day, 289 days. That's when we became acquainted with the fact that depending on what side of the social scale you were in, the law was either a friend or was the big enemy, and you had to change it.
So we talked about it taking 289 days to register a business in Peru. I can guarantee you that if, businessman X from family, A tries to start a business, he could do it within 5. And we've actually have research that shows that within each country, there's a big range in which things can happen extremely fast and efficient in developing countries. If you know the minister, if you have connections. And if you don't, you're on the other end. So it's not that people don't have the capacity to be much more efficient. It's that the access is not democratized.
The legal systems are simply unfriendly to poor people.
What people are really hostile to is markets that are manipulated, markets that are not competitive, markets in which there isn't a level playing field. There's oligopolies, cartels.
When you go from these heavy, oppressive, authoritarian regimes, communist regimes, and you replace them with oligarchies, you haven't really done anything substantial economically. You can have all kinds of people trading things that you could, in a sense, call mini capitalists. But when those markets are restricted, this is not a free economy.
Just as there are people who use communism just simply to stay in power and to be able to have a discourse, some kind of a speech that allows them to justify the reason of their permanence in power, well, some businessmen use all the intellectual structures of capitalism to preserve their old privileges, but in fact they're feudal because it's very hard to get inside the game without their permission. They use the terms but not the content.
One place where the rule of law problem is vividly apparent is in the area of property rights. Imagine if there were no private property. If you didn't even know who owned the land you lived on. It wouldn't only change the way you work, it would change the way you view the world. Now in the West, we take private property for granted. But lack of clear private property rights is one of the greatest challenges facing the developing world. In some countries, over 70% of the land has no clear title. You can't get out of poverty without private property.
The rule of law is more than property. But what I'm saying is that what makes people interested in the rule of law, the first thing that they understand is that everybody on this earth lives on a plot of land. We're earthlings. And so if you come around and say, look, we have found rules that determine how far you can go and how far somebody else can go, how you're going to share or not share water, how you're going to have passing rights or not having passing rights, that's the first thing that anybody needs to understand the rule of law. And it's quite clear that when you go to the third world and people are warring against each other, there's high crimes, there are ethnic rivalries, Once you settle the issue of who lives where and who does what with who, people start understanding the value of standard rules. That you not only have to have rules that you and your group respect, but that everybody understands. That moment, the simplest person can understand the law.
Property rights are a terrible problem. Terrible, terrible problem. Like 60-70% of our people are farmers. Just imagine if you have 10 million farmers who have no title to the land they're farming on. We haven't got clean title in Ghana. It's very, very difficult. You buy land, you have to buy it 4 or 5 times. If you're looking for farmland as a small peasant farmer, you're looking for 5 acres to buy. You can get 5 acres from the chief by giving him a drink. But you don't own the 5 acres. So you can't go to the bank with the 5 acres as your collateral to then borrow money to buy a tractor. You can't start an economy without ownership not being in question. This is my fundamental.
A property right as opposed to sovereignty means it doesn't have a flag. It belongs to smaller groups of people, and it's fungible. It can be sold and it can be bought. So say you're not given a property right. Let's look at all the indigenous people of the Americas who never got a property right, so that they couldn't lose it, they couldn't drink it away, they couldn't do a bad investment. Did they keep it? No, they've lost it much more than those who are getting property rights today. So in each case, what we should do is go to indigenous people and say, what do you want? Sovereignty, so that the Indian chief decides what's going to happen, or a property right? I tell you the answer right away. But they're not generally given those options.
One of the great sad stories is something that looked like the start of a real honest industrial revolution. Started in China about the 10th century. They had some small iron smelters, and people who owned them kept reinvesting in increased production, and they got bigger and bigger, and they suddenly started making all kinds of agricultural utensils out of iron and steel, and these blast furnaces going day and night, and of course it's all coming on boats down the Yangtze and the Yellow and what, all that good stuff. And eventually the Mandarins discovered this was going on, and that ordinary people were getting rich. They stopped it. They closed it down. The whole thing stopped and went away. Look, a great historian of Asia put it well. He said, private property is not secure. And that's the first and last and total answer to why there was no development in the East. If they can come and take my steel mill away from me and close it down, well, my relatives have learned no point starting again. Let's get a government job.
Property rights play an essential role in economic development, but there's evidence that their effect runs much deeper.
Here in Argentina, there's an interesting study to see what happens when people who did not have private property get private property. Well, it not only changes their economic relationship with others, it actually changes their worldview.
We found that the people in the title parcels, they trust each other more. We found that children in the title houses are more likely to go into secondary school. They have a lower school absenteeism. They have better health. They show lower teenage pregnancies. Land title integrated them to the average population, and now they seem to share the belief and the values of the more average population, although they are still quite poor.
The roots of widespread private property can be found in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which recognizes the importance of private property, not only for economics, but for personal responsibility and a deep connection to community. We can see the importance of private property in the Ten Commandments, with Abraham in Genesis 23 and throughout the Old and New Testaments.
God affirms private property. He gives us boundary markers, mile markers, stones that mark off one person's property from another person's property. Think about it for a minute. You cannot be generous with somebody else's stuff. You can only be generous with your stuff, which means it has to be your own property that you give away.
Private property is especially important for families because it creates the space for them to live out their freedoms and their responsibilities.
Property matters because ultimately it points back to stewardship. God entrusts a piece of the creation to an individual or a set of individuals to take care of. You can find this in the Jewish Torah tradition. You can find this in all kinds of religious traditions. But there's a basic misunderstanding that some people have when it comes to the New Testament of the Christian scriptures. They think Christians have been called in this new era of the Spirit to common ownership of all material goods based on Acts 2 and 4 in the New Testament. I understand how that happens, but it's actually a fundamental misunderstanding of what God's call to stewardship is for all of the earth.
In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 4, we read there a section of Scripture that is really a stumbling block to many Christians. Christians often read that part of Scripture and they come away with the conclusion that, see, what's there is referring to some form of socialism. I maintain that it really has nothing to do with socialism, although we can learn a lot from Acts chapter 4. People do sell some of what they have, but it's a voluntary decision to do that. Barnabas, who's mentioned at the end of Acts chapter 4, voluntarily sells a field. Not all of his property, not his house and all of his belongings. He sells a field, and he takes the proceeds from that sale and gives it to the faithful. Then if you go over in Acts chapter 5, you see that Ananias and Sapphira are struck dead. And some would say, well, see, they're struck dead because they didn't give their money to the church. That's not what Peter says. What he says there is that they're struck dead because they lied to the Holy Spirit. And so in Acts chapter 4 and 5, we can learn a lot about how the church ought to regard one another, how we ought to treat one another, how we ought to share with one another. We ought to exemplify caritas, a real mutual love for one another. But it is not a proposal for socialism.
Hernando de Soto wrote an important book called The Mystery of Capital, in which he asked why the West grew so wealthy compared to the rest of the world. He said the mystery was private property and rule of law. But he didn't really explain how the West got these things. That explanation can be found in the history of Christianity, which laid the moral, economic, and theological foundations for private property, for justice and rule of law, and for the dignity of the person and the dignity of work.
There's a very interesting connection that most people do not recognize between the God-ordained right to private property and titling. And that is, actually goes all the way back to Adam. It has to do with naming. The naming function that Adam expressed with respect to the animals. So these animals are coming by him, and he's saying, that's a zebra, and that's an elephant, and that's this. The right to a title is a lot like naming an animal in this respect. It defines stewardship reality. It defines a private property reality that God has entrusted to an individual. That reality is seen in the Protestant tradition, in the Catholic tradition, in the broad Christian tradition.
Questions of private property and rule of law really boil down to the issue of justice. Without justice, there's no foundation to build enterprise or create wealth. See, the problem is that this is hard and slow and unglamorous work, and it doesn't really lend itself to a trendy celebrity campaign.
There is a lot of passion for many subjects that are attractive in the short term, and there is very little passion in terms of opening up the economy, in terms of strengthening, furthering institution, fiscal responsibility. Why? because some of them are so hard to do that people don't want to invest their political capital on them, and they want short-term wins. And if they can keep happy those that make a louder noise, that's good enough for them.
In Nicaragua, there has been some progress lately in the country with regards to titling and enforcement of contracts, for example, but still there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The problem with these issues is that they don't make for a good photo op. They are not. They don't require a simple solution that will be achieved in the short term, and yet they are enormously important.
Hernando de Soto describes the developing world as teeming with entrepreneurs. There are millions of people like Joshua Omoga who are trying to better their lives but struggle because they don't have private property rights and rule of law that would allow them to grow their businesses. They remain what Muhammad Yunus calls bonsai people. We talk a lot about justice for the poor and oftentimes think in terms of transferring our resources or charity. But this is only short-term help. For long-term sustainable development, the poor need private property and rule of law. Without this, they're trapped. They can't build businesses. They can't build equity in their homes. And then they become dependent on charity. This is not an easy task, but for the church and for those concerned with justice for the poor, private property and rule of law are essential.
So that was episode 3 of the PovertyCure DVD series. So again, there are 6 parts to it. And one particular insight that's really crucial to understand is that poverty is really more people don't have things because they don't have access to markets, because they don't have rule of law. Lack of stuff is more of a symptom. It's not a root cause of poverty. So we just saw one of the major root causes of poverty, and that's lack of rule of law, lack of property rights. Probably like we at Acton and PovertyCure really think that people have the creative capacity to become the solutions to their problems as far as lack of things and poverty. They have the ability to get out of poverty themselves, but they just don't have the base. And that's where the rule of law is so crucial and key to establishing. That's where your guys' profession is a big part of solving that problem. So I think I just wanted us to kind of just make yourself available to.
Sure. Do we have any questions? Or are you wondering, what do I do now? Is there anybody that wants to ask questions?
I'll bring Patrick up here too in case you want any additional.
I can add some things. I'll talk to you guys' ears off though if you're careful, so you can. But no questions. This had to inspire some questions, right? Somebody has to have a question about property right. What do I do? Some of you are probably thinking, well, this was all focused on the developing world. What do I do actually here in Grand Rapids? Is that fair? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's fair.
How can you be? So I had the honor to be here a month ago for an event that we were doing for the Hispanic community, specifically focused on poverty and community development. And I realized that many of the entrepreneurs here in our minority communities in Grand Rapids are struggling with these exact same issues. For example, one woman had, her name was Mayra. She had started a hair braiding business here in Grand Rapids. And I asked her, she's talking, she said, I really want to grow my business. I really want to grow my business. She said this in front of the group. And I said, well, why can't you? She said, well, because nobody in our community has the license. Nobody has a license to do the hair braiding. And I thought this was, I'd heard these stories from around the country that hair braiding regulation was issued. But she said, I can't hire someone because no one has a license because they can't afford or they can't get the proper training easily. They don't have the network to get the training. And so she's stuck with just being herself in this business. So it's this thing where over-regulation is hampering businesses here in Grand Rapids. It's a barrier to entry for people like Mayura, who was here in this building just a month ago. So it's fighting for people like this. I know Luis Avila over at Barnum Law has done a lot of fantastic work fighting for regulatory frameworks reform for people starting businesses here in Grand Rapids. But then even if you go back to the 80s, we're seeing this then. Mother Teresa tried to start a home for old people in New York City and was shut down because she wanted to build an elevator. It was against her religious order to build an elevator in the building. So the city told her, well, you can't start a home for old people here. You can't start a religious charity here in New York City unless you build this elevator. And they couldn't afford it, and it was against their religion. So they shut them down. And when they asked her, how are you going to get people to the other floor, she said, we're going to carry them on our backs. But they wouldn't let her open. So it's things like this where government ends up crowding out private, individual, charitable efforts. But it also crowds out businesses, and they make it extremely difficult for businesses to start. In Peru, it takes 289 days. In the Philippines, it takes 30 years just to gain title to your land. So this isn't the exception. This is kind of the norm in the developing world. Yes.
So quick question, you were saying that you guys, basically what you guys do around the world, you guys do also here in the city. Is there, a way that we can, get involved in terms of, doing things in the city instead of having to travel? If we can get more, I can get more information on that.
Well, definitely. So to piggyback on that, to piggyback on that, oftentimes we say, we think about charitable efforts or poverty and say, well, how can I help someone in the developing world? How can I contribute to world vision or this cause? But I really want to challenge everyone to think, what are the needs in my community? We can be a lot more impactful with our neighbors, right? We can have a lot greater impact on the homeless man that's on the corner when you walk out of Cooley Law School than we can with somebody living in the developing world. So I challenge us to think about the opportunities to serve in our community. So how can we serve in our community? Do your research. There's tons of great organizations here in Grand Rapids, like Mel Trotter Ministries, which is literally right next door here. Find out what they're doing. They're helping people like this. The Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, for example, is doing amazing work. They're helping entrepreneurs get businesses off the ground, and they need volunteers. And then not just Hispanic volunteers, but volunteers in general, people to help come, especially lawyers. When they were here, they were saying, this rule of law, private property, contract negotiation, things like this are stuff that they really need help with. And there's ways that we can be involved. Well, not me personally, I'm not a lawyer, but ways that you guys can really be involved and make a difference in entrepreneurs' lives and people's lives in general. I think Heather brought up, the occupational licensing is a really big deal, and it might be kind of ironic since you guys are all lawyers and seeking an occupational license essentially when you get past the bar. But there are a lot of low-income people, whether it's hair braiding or some other, it's like cosmetology, lots of these different things where people are just trying to start a business. They're trying to make profits for their family and whatnot. But what happens is that barriers to entry are created in this market. So there's there are licenses, or there are lots of schooling that they have to get through just to do some of these important but simple jobs. And having the ability to, in your guys' position in law, to push back against those requirements for people would be huge. And so understand what kind of licenses, what kind of regulations are keeping poor people from starting businesses to create wealth for themselves and their communities. And in that way, I think you can make a big impact as well. Any other questions or thoughts?
As far as the role of capitalism, I think one of the speakers touched on it as far as that, in essence, being a barrier as well. Although we may view it as being a free market enterprise, obviously the status quo has a interest in keeping the situation as is.
So that's a lot of the capitalism we see in developing countries, and more so every day here in the United States, isn't real capitalism, right? It's just crony capitalism where it's businesses getting favors from government institutions. It's partnerships. It's really an oligopoly, right? And we're for a free market approach these days to business, right? Ease of starting a business is extremely important. Having access to markets of exchange is extremely important. Being able to sell your goods on a global market, which is what lots of people in developing countries lack. But yes, the structure of crony capitalism that we see in a lot of developing countries ends up being a barrier for a lot of people to enter, and ends up being a result that results in over-regulation of businesses and why it takes so long for a small entrepreneur to get something off the ground. Is that what you're kind of asking?
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, I don't think it's limited to the third world necessarily. I think it's everywhere, but it's just magnified in that area in particular. I don't see how you get rid of that unless you, fundamentally transform capitalism or the structure of it. Or, you know what I mean? Because why would you change that structure if you benefited from it for all these years?
Exactly. Those with the power wants to stay the same, and those who don't have the exactly. But that's where I think we can really start to advocate for these principles, both here in the United States and around the world. And when people start advocating, people start talking about this, that's when things start to change. Like we said at the end, putting a fight for a wristband that says we want more private property rights. We want greater rule of law. It's not sexy. That's not something that lends itself to a celebrity campaign. But what it does is, hey, we can end poverty if we send $72 billion to the developing world tomorrow, which that just isn't the case because poor people aren't poor because they lack material resources. They're not poor because they lack clothes or money. They're poor because they don't have access to markets, access to networks of exchange. And when you lack these networks, it's hard to develop. But you're exactly right. Until things change at the top, it's hard to see change throughout the rest of the system. Yeah. So that's where brilliant people like you come to play.
They were really in trouble.
Guess we could start a T-shirt campaign like enforcement of contracts. Three people would buy them.
But another interesting thing, they're in the informal economy globally, and in what we would call the developing world, $9 billion is locked up in extra legal assets. So things that we can't get collateral. You can't go to the bank and take a loan out with this. And that's tragic. That's more than the total amount of aid that we send to the developing world every year. So think about that. If we can just find ways to formalize people's extra legal assets, bring it into the formal economy, that impact would be exponential, right? You would now be able to take a loan out to grow your business, take a loan out to buy a home, things that you can't do now.
How many of you guys remember what started the Arab Spring? I actually didn't know what started until recently. This is just the stories just to kind of emphasize the importance of rule of law and really what you guys do. So the Arab Spring started in January of 2011, and what happened was a man named Mohammed in Tunisia set himself on fire. And the reason he did that was because all of his assets, which have been calculated to just $225, were taken from him by the police because he was in the black market, essentially. His business wasn't formally recognized, and so he was just selling stuff on the side. And so he had no protection from the law, and all of his assets were stolen. His life was completely ruined, essentially. And what he said right before he let himself on fire was, "How do you expect me to make a living?" Now, the Arab Spring people always see it as a fight for political rights. It actually started as a right for just to engage in the market and just have a business. And this set off a whole, you guys know the Arab Spring, all the way from that to 63 other entrepreneurs did the same thing. They set them on fire. And again, it wasn't because of political rights that they were demanding freedom and liberty. It was actually just for the ability to start a business and engage in the market. And just think of like because of the lack of rule of law, what happened to Muhammad. Think of everything that has happened because of that. The Syrian civil war, all the mass immigration to Europe, all the election results as a result of that. Like, lack of rule of law has had just a cascading effect in world history. And so rule of law is extremely, extremely important. It can have real dire effects. So the rule of law and holding that up and allowing people to access markets and allowing people to engage when they didn't work formally is so key and so important. Did you have a question?
Yeah. How do you ensure that if there are all these areas that no one has rights to, and there are all these little businesses, how do you ensure that the people that are there working get the rights to it instead of it going to just being split up between the elites or something like that?
Yeah.
So that's a good question. Here's in a lot of these instances, the people in the community do know who owns the land. So if you were going to ask Joshua Moga, who's on here, well, where's your land? What are the boundaries of your business? He would know exactly where those boundaries are, and his neighbor would know exactly where those boundaries are. The problem is it's not formally recognized by the government. They're probably not signing a paper. It's probably been changed hands 13, 14 times, this one little property. And there's no good documentation of here. So what it really takes is somebody to come in and just define these boundaries, right? And that's how we started saying, and Hernando de Soto, who you saw in the film, has done a ton of amazing work with this, with like geolocation. We're starting to see some of it being tied up in Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's, Hernando de Soto's big in this, Bitcoin's easier to track the exchanges over time. So they're starting to use Bitcoin to help define property rights and sales of property. A bunch of different ways. Now, there's still the issue of, is the government going to actually recognize this? Are legal institutions actually going to recognize this? And that's still up for question. And that's what Hernando de Soto works on with a lot of governments pay him to come contract and help them figure out their property rights situation. But as he said, when people are actually assigned private property, when they say this is yours and we can't do anything with it, it's yours to grow. Like in Buenos Aires, it wasn't just that they grew economically. Like people flourished, right? They went to school longer. They got better educations. They had better networks of exchange.
They trusted each other. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Or well, thank you very much.
One thing. This is a 6-part series, so there's 5 more episodes. They're all fantastic. We also have Poverty Inc., which is our feature-length documentary, which is really an inspiring film. It's won 50 film festival awards. It's shown all over the world. It's been shown at nearly 300 universities now, probably 800 screenings total. It's on Netflix, so check it out. I mean, I'm sure most of you have Netflix. Poverty Inc. It should be pretty easy to find that.
Well, that was another great guest this week on the Law School Insider. If you have an interest in being a guest on the show, drop me an email at lawschoolinsider@Cooley, COOLEY.edu. And thank you all for listening today. And remember, you have the ability and right to take control of your law school's success. I hope you'll continue listening, creating a plan for success that will prepare you to achieve the dreams that you have set for yourself. Talk to you next time. Thanks for listening. You're on your way to being a law school insider. Please subscribe to stay connected and come back again next time as we speak to more students, lawyers, and employers.